let's get started about mind into matter. How does what's in an artist's mind turn out into the matter? Why does it matter, and how does it turn into matter? I have drifted in the company of whales, freeing my creative soul. I have paddled on the arteries of the earth, feeling the beat of its sacred heart. And I have stared into the eyes of the wolf, liberating myself from convention. I miss my dad. I really miss the 70s. And my hands tell the story of my subconscious. And it's all about awakening and awareness. So I spend a lot of time in a kayak. I've been kayaking since sometime in the mid-90s, mostly flat water kayaking, and I've paddled all over the United States and a lot of Canada. And I've had some amazing close encounters and experiences in nature that really shaped me as an individual. So one of the most profound experiences was kayaking with orcas off of the coast of British Columbia and Vancouver Island. And so I've been as close to an orca as I am to that wall. I literally had a female swim down underneath my kayak. I could see her saddle patch, which is that white patch, go under one side and come up right about at the doors. I mean, I nearly could touch her. On a different trip on the East Coast in Canada, I had paddled about 4 days back into the wilderness in an area that's kind of like the Boundary Waters, where once you get past the first lake, you have to portage from lake to lake to lake. No motorboats, no jet skis, no anything. So I'm 4 days back and had the opportunity to wake up one morning and go sit out by myself on this lake, and I was alone in my kayak, and all of a sudden I felt the heartbeat of the earth. And I've never felt it before, never felt it since, but it was that. And I could feel the vibrations. I could understand where Native American music came from and indigenous music comes from that beat, from people that are so connected to the environment. And then on that same trip, in fact, it was the day that we turned around to come back, I had a very close encounter with wild wolves. So this was our campsite. So it's backcountry, but they do have designated campsites, so you don't just totally trash the environment. So this was our campsite. It's a little bit clear, and this kind of sloped down to the water, and there's a long stretch of water and then another island on the other side. And anyway, we got up in the morning. I'm literally making pancakes on the campfire in the middle of the site, and I hear this splash, and I look in the water, and about 300 yards off, like tiny, I see this deer head swimming across the channel, and I see three little deer heads following it. So I'm like, Krebs, we're traveling with a friend. It's like, Chrissy, come on, look. We're watching. The deer hops up, runs into the woods. The next head pops out, and it's a wolf. So it's three wolves following this deer. So they chase it way up into the woods, and we're like blown away that we've even like had this experience and seen this. So I go back to making pancakes, and we're cleaning up camp to turn around and go, and all of a sudden, it's about an hour later, one of the wolves on our piece of land howls. And so Chrissy could howl pretty well. I said, Chrissy, stand in the middle of the site and howl. So she howls back, and the wolf answers. And they start howling back and forth to each other. The next thing I know, all four wolves come bolting like out of the door, like right toward us. And the first one saw us and saw we were human and took off and ran way down and jumped in the water and swam across where it had been. And then a second one goes, we go down to the water and watch. Second one goes, third one goes, and the fourth one never goes. And all of a sudden I have this feeling, and I turn around and I look, and right up by that log, right on the edge of the campsite, is a baby wolf. And I turn around and we make eye contact, and it nearly knocked me over. It was one of the most powerful experiences I've ever had with a sentient body. It was unbelievably incredible. And then after a little bit, it ran off and did its thing. But what's really interesting about those experiences is that I do believe a lot in spirit energy and animal energy and universal energies and things like that. And so all of this kind of coincided with what was going on in my life that led me into the art world. So at the time, I was a full-time professional. I was a vice president of an ad agency, and I was trying to find some new creative outlets. So it turns out that whale energy is all about diving deep down into yourself, finding your creativity, and bringing it back up. So that was the first one. And then it was a year later that I had this wolf trip, and a wolf trip is all about freedom and releasing yourself and things like that. And and I didn't find this second part out until later, but it turns out that wolf pups take between 18 and 24 months to leave the den, to leave the pack. Well, I left my job as a marketing executive 24 months almost to the day that I saw that wolf. And that was, of course, totally unplanned. So I know it's a little bit of a long start, but those events really started to shape me because I listened to that energy and I found more creativity, and I thought, I need some freedom. I need to be on my own. I need to be that, kind of that alpha wolf and take control of my life, which for me meant leaving the corporate world. And I loved the corporate world when I did it. I had no problems with the corporate world. I was just ready to be done. We all have things that happen in our lives that shape our lives. Some are traumatic. The biggest one for me was the loss of my dad when I was 10. And, we all have stuff, right? But for me, that was a big one. He went to work one day, had a heart attack at work, and never saw him again. And so, talk about abandonment issues, right? But I miss my dad. But the way it relates to my artwork is that for some reason, birch trees always reminded me of my dad. In fact, this is the house we lived in before he died. But this is the kind of stuff I usually lived in. And I always associate this house and birch trees with him. So that would come out much later as a cathartic element in my artwork. Other than that, I actually had a pretty good life. I grew up as a middle-class kid in a place called Mahopac, New York. It's about an hour and a half north of Manhattan. I grew up in the woods. I got up, I went fishing. Everybody had to get up, do their chores, and then you just went and played all day long, and that was it, and it was great. And so I grew up again as a normal kid. I wanted to be a professional baseball player, except I stopped growing after 8th grade, so that kind of fell through. I wanted to be a rock star. That's me on your right, and I didn't have any talent, so that kind of fell through. So I decided, all right, I better try something else. Being an artist, that also kind of fell through too. This is my first mug, circa 1974, Mr. Volpe's 5th grade art class. And I'm an Italian from New York. And so I had this vision of this mug being like a maiolica piece with all these bright yellows and blues and greens, like it just came out of Tuscany. So I dipped it in every single glaze. That's what you get when you dip it in every single glaze. So I didn't have a very auspicious start as an artist. So I decided to go to school. I went to Ithaca College, got a degree in communication, came out, had the corporate job that I told you about. And sometime in the 90s, I was in my mid-30s, I decided that I needed a creative outlet. I'd been doing a lot of photography, which was really fun. And I had some pretty good art history background from undergrad, because as a communications major, I was a liberal arts major, so I had a bunch of art and architecture, art history, just for fun. So anyway, I took a class from the local potter. This was, ended up being who became Uncle Lloyd, but he was an ex-pro football player who then, after he retired, went back to art school, became an art teacher, and then ended up being a production potter. He was the greatest guy. His pinkies were like bigger than my thumbs, but he just made like mugs and bowls and toothbrush holders and knocked it out of the park. He was a total production potter, did the tours and so on. So he was my first teacher. And so I did that kind of on and off for a few years. But one of the things when you're a potter that you do is the teacher says, make 20 mugs. So I made 20 mugs. I was a single guy at the time. I needed a mug. I got 19 extra mugs. So I started doing some art fairs, like 2 or 3 a year, street fairs where you set up your tent. And I made it a hobby that paid for itself. So I started my own first pottery. I called it Muddy Paws Pottery. It was named after a sleepy black lab. And I really was a true production potter. It was all about like volume and doing things and making things. And so all this is happening simultaneously to the whale trip and the wolf trip. And I decided I want to leave the corporate world, and I don't know what I want to do. And so I thought, well, while I figure out what's next, I'll just make more pots and do some more art fairs, and that should cover my mortgage, and we'll see what happens next. And what's next never really happened. But even up until that point, I still never really intended for it to be a career. So I'm making typical street fair wares, rice bowls, and dinnerware, toothbrush holders, things like that. It's amazing how much money you can make making toothbrush holders. Like everybody has toothbrushes, needs a toothbrush holder. They really paid the bills for a long time. Then I met a woman with a great garage. So I married her. and ended up becoming a full-time potter. Like everything was gone, everything was done. I stopped. I had been doing some teaching at Ithaca College. I stopped everything and just became a full-time potter. And it was at that time that I met an artist named Alion, and he was a world-renowned Metropolitan, Smithsonian level artist, and he came into Cornell University. I was up in Ithaca at the time, and he came into Cornell University on a fellowship. They opened up some workshops to the local potter, and so I took a teapot workshop with him. And we became fast friends. We just had a lot in common. And the night before he went back to Taiwan, I thought, who better to ask about my career than Alion? And so at this point, I've been a full-time potter for like 6 months. So I said, Alion, what's next for me as a potter? And he said, Eric, you need to make better pots. And so I kind of held him to it a little bit. So he said, give me a month. A month later, he calls me up. He says, can you come to Taiwan? So fortunately, I could. And so I went to Taiwan and studied a variety of different things. So Alion first made his name as an Yixing teapot maker. And Yixing teapots are the little tiny teapots that are going to be what I use in the tea ceremony on Saturday night. But anyway, what he did was he took this old tradition. Yixing is a place in China. It's actually the birthplace of the teapot. And he gave it contemporary form. He then went on to take clay and carve it to look like wood, which also goes back to that Yixing tea ceremony, but he did it in a grander scale. And he became a world-renowned artist. So he set me up in Taiwan to study with 4 different masters. In fact, the first time I was there, I didn't even study with him. I studied with 4 masters. None of them spoke English, and I didn't speak any Chinese. I got the CDs, but the invitation came in October. I was there by January. Like, there was no way I was going to learn Chinese in 3 months at 40 whatever years old I was. That part of my brain is gone. But I got to go to Taiwan. And Alion had promised that I would live in this small little pottery village. So Alion lives in Taipei City, big, huge international city, millions of people. So they're going to set you up in this little tiny pottery village. So I'm thinking of like the beautiful Taiwan, right? Formosa, beautiful island, everything else. So he sets me up in this place called Yinger, which is a small pottery village of about 500,000 people. It's about 500,000 people in my little pottery town. But it really was a pottery town. Everything in Yinger was clay, from sinks and tile and production and toilets, like industrial porcelains, all the way down to the little humble potter and everything in between. It had an outdoor street mall with literally 100 galleries where you could buy a 50-cent teacup or a $30,000 clay sculpture. And right adjacent to that was the National Ceramic Museum. So I got this incredible, incredible education in my little tiny pottery village. So in addition to clay, of course, I had lots of influence from the Chinese architecture, Chinese culture. For those who don't know, Taiwan's actually part of China. It's got its own government, but it's technically part of China, and it's also got a lot of influences from other areas. The biggest one that I found important to my work was the Japanese occupation of Taiwan, and so there's a lot of Japanese art there. And Japanese is actually my favorite aesthetic. Asian art in general is, but Japanese is my preferred. So I was fortunate to be able to study Taiwanese art, Chinese art, and Japanese art all in the same place, in addition to the Dutch occupation influence and the Western influence. So I studied with a lot of different masters, studied a lot of ways of handling my body, handling clay that I didn't learn here. And so I really came out with a great education in terms of making functional pottery, which is what I was there to do. While I was there, I did a residency within the residency at a place called Shui Li Snake Kiln and Cultural Park. And that had this master that I worked with, and he was an older gentleman. He was about this tall, and he would make the hugest pots using this technique called chipe, which is where you take a big coil of clay and you literally put that snake right around your body. And the pot stays still and you go around it. So he would go around the pot for hours and hours and hours, but you literally can make anything you want. In fact, he made the largest pot that was in the Guinness Book of World Records, and you had to use scaffolding and everything else to do it. But what was great about him was he always had a cigarette in his mouth. So he was like the Keith Richards of potters. And so he'd make these huge pots, and then you'd go to put them in the kiln, and you'd roll them in, and you'd look in the pot, and the whole inside is just a pile of ashes and cigarette butts inside this pot. And he worked worked in the round his whole entire life. And so one of the things I did, he taught me this chipe method, and one of the things I did was I made this kidney-shaped fountain to leave behind as a thank you to the organization. And every time he just couldn't fathom this like not round thing. And every time he'd walk by my station, he'd just go, "Oh, Ali," and he'd walk away like, "Oh my God." So, but it was a trip. But this was the view from my wheel. So I did finally get what I envisioned having in Taiwan, because this was out in Nantao County, which is tea country. So I'm out in the mountains for that. What came out of that residency was a body of work that I ended up calling Opened Earth. And it's a body of work where you actually heat the outside of the clay. So this is a pot thrown on the potter's wheel. You heat the clay on the outside and then throw it some more and it cracks it open. So I didn't invent it. It's been done in the East and West for a long time, but it really came out of the environment that was there. So I'm going to quickly go through a bunch of images and look at them not as beautiful pictures, but look at the patterns and the textures in there. And this was really my first endeavor, my first encounter with something other than just a blue or green mug, but in terms of actually really taking clay and turning it into artwork. So you start to see these patterns now in the things that I'm making. So this was actually my first ceramics teapot, monthly teapot, but it's this in here that I wanted, that beautiful cracked open type of clay. And a lot of these are teapots because tea is, of course, really strong in China. But you start to see those patterns showing up in the work. And I took a very small, like, sort of dipped my toe into sculptural work. So what happened was I came back. I was making better pots, but I was making those crusty, unglazed pots. And I almost went out of business at that point because there wasn't really a market for it. They were potter's pots. They were getting into the pottery magazines and things like that, but I couldn't sell any of them. Didn't fit the American aesthetic. And they were in this in-between place money-wise, budget-wise. So I used to make a living making $18, $20 mugs. Got to make a lot of them, but you actually can do it. And now I make a living making $20,000, $30,000 sculptures. You actually can do it. Try to sell a $400 or $600 teapot, and it's nearly impossible because it's too expensive for somebody to use to break in their dishwasher, and it's not expensive enough for a very high-end, sophisticated collection. So somehow I managed to get through that. But it was a make better pot, but pretty much almost lose all of it. I did have a lot of influence from Yixing, as I mentioned. So Yixing is Yixing, is a place in China. It's about 4 hours west of Shanghai. It's the birthplace of the teapot. And so everything teapot related comes out of Yixing. But the other thing that comes out of Yixing is in the 1600s, they started to carve the teapots, and they're small. Again, for those of you who come on Saturday, you'll see. But they started to carve them to look like pumpkins and gourds and tree trunks to integrate nature into the tea ceremony. So anything in clay that looks like something else. Any clay trompe l'oeil is really theoretically derivative of 400-year-old Yixing teapots. So just a couple of quick examples of what they were like. This is one of my all-time favorite pots. This is a pumpkin, but look at that pot. It's like, looks like it's just taking a breath. Like it's just so alive. I mean, it's just a gorgeous piece of artwork. So I came back, I was doing the Opened Earth work, and I also started making Yixing teapots. And so I gave those my own interpretation, and these again are all really, really small, but nobody's buying them because we don't brew tea in little tiny teapots. We don't do things in unglazed clay. And so that was all part of that same package. Fortunately, I was still making $20 mugs, still had some wholesale accounts, managed to keep it going. But then one winter, up in New York, not different than Blowing Rock, probably after the holidays, you don't sell a lot of artwork until spring. So it's January, I don't have much to do. I thought I'm going to try one of those Allione Yixing style tree trunk teapots. So I make two little teapots. I think they're pretty good. I send my slides off to this museum exhibition in Buffalo. They both get curated in, and one becomes the postcard piece. So it didn't make the postcard because it's the best piece. It just like matched the designer's font or whatever. But anyway, I'm feeling pretty good about myself at this point. I'm feeling pretty cocky. I send my postcard off to Allione. I say, hey, what do you think of me now? And I get a phone call, Ali, you better come back to Taiwan. Like I'm going to stop this train wreck before it happens. So at this point, I had my first daughter, and so I wanted to go for a short time. I went for a month and did an intensive in Allione's studio, and I did study trompe l'oeil, and that's how I initially learned. And my training there was he spent about 2.5 hours with me, showed me some technique, put a $30,000 teapot in front of me and said, make it. and I spent the next month making it. And he and his assistant would come and help me and whatever, but that was pretty much it. But they had to kick me out of the studio every night. I was there for 14 hours a day, and they'd be like, Ali, go home, go home, go home at the end of the day. But that was how I learned. So it was pretty much, don't give you a fish, you know, I'll teach you how to fish. And that was the perspective. That was the Asian way of teaching how to do this. So I came back and I started making trompe l'oeil work. And that one, just for scale, that one is probably about this big. So this is a teapot. So there's the handle, there's the spout, the lid is kind of tucked in there. And I'm making teapots initially as a way to practice this technique and to honor the 400-year-old tradition. So they're looking kind of like this. And I played around with some pine, which is another tree from there. And then I thought, all right, so I'm getting good at this, but I don't want to be an Allion knockoff. I don't want to be a Chinese I Ching teapot maker knockoff. If you go to tea shop in southern China or Taiwan, there are pots all over that are carved to look like pumpkins and gourds and tree trunks, and some of them are really, really good. So I thought, how do I separate myself from that? So I did an exercise that we potters do, or probably other arts do as well, and it's when you create, you think about 50, 100 different adjectives that you want to describe that body of work, and you narrow it down to, say, 8 to a dozen. And those become your touchstone. Those become the things that unify that body of work. So these were the characteristics that I put to my body of work. I wanted the work to look alive. I wanted it to look breathtaking and graceful, gestural, harmonious and rhythmic, sensual, sophisticated, emotive, and narrative. So I printed that out, stuck it on the wall of my studio, and it's not like every piece has to have every one, but again, when you start to make creative decisions, I could look at that, or even just by being around it, it was in me, and that having those elements, or some of those elements in every pot, brought it all together. The other thing two thoughts at once. So what I want to do is I want to show you how I make each of those elements come to life. So this is the part of like, how does it get from here to out? So I want the works to look alive. It's kind of ironic because I make dead trees. But when I'm talking about alive, I'm talking about the form being alive. I'm not talking about the tree being alive. So it's about the motion and the movement. And so imagine all of these as best as you can without the texture, just in silhouette. And that's where I want to start to bring that aliveness into the pot. Or even this basket. This is little. It's a little tiny basket like that. But it's like that pumpkin, right? Like it's looking like it's breathing. It's looking like it's alive. And those are the elements I'm trying to build into the pot as I start to make them. In fact, and I'm sure Gabe would back me up on this, the biggest reason that most of my work is in museum is not because it looks like wood. I don't think there's any MFA student that I couldn't teach to do it, and with a month of practice, couldn't make stuff look just like wood, just as well as I can. What makes it different or better or good enough to be in a museum is the form. It's all about the form and the design and the emotion and the story. So form, including that, making it breathe. That's the part of the form in that piece that brings it alive. Same with this book, the motion in those, oops, there we go. The motion in those pages is what gives it life. That's what makes it look alive. I want the work to be breathtaking. I want it to really move people and take their breath away. And that's done in a lot of different ways, and it's different for everybody who looks at it, but a lot of it is in the design, a lot of it's in the negative space. Sometimes it's in scale. This one is about 7 feet tall, so scale can come into play with any of these elements. And I'm always thinking about the whole piece when I'm doing design, and I'm always thinking about snapshots. Like, what part might somebody see in this? So I'm thinking big, and I'm also thinking narrowed in. So I want all of these characteristics to come out in both ways. I want the work to look graceful. I just wanted to have kind of this romanticized sort of feeling of grace in it. Here's another example where you have grace on the big level, and then you also have grace on the small level. So you can look at that pot in a variety of different ways and see the grace. Isn't that funny? I still call them pots. Like, they're really sculptures, but like, once you're a potter, you're a potter. Like, it's still call it that. Incidentally, the pot is, everything in here is clay. Even the rocks are clay in that piece. So again, I'm wanting to have that beauty for the whole piece and close up. I want the work to be gestural. I want to be, there's some human gesture to it. And in fact, it doesn't even need to be human gesture, but a lot of the works do have certain humanity to them. I'm not really doing figurative work. I wouldn't consider any of this figurative work, but certainly there is a lot of anthropomorphism in the work. This piece is down in the exhibition. You've probably, hopefully, seen that. And so it's bringing in those elements. And the gesture doesn't have to be anthropomorphic or human. Even the gesture in that peeled back birch bark is giving life, giving gesture to the pot. Here's one that's maybe like a rock star tossing their hair or something like that. Incidentally, my first concert was Kiss at Madison Square Garden, just to frame my childhood. I want the work to be harmonious, so the elements of the work, the components of the work have to work together like a spout and a handle. Again, the negative space is really what carries a lot of that. Here is also another spout and handle that work together and help bring the viewer's eye through the piece, so there's a lot of harmony in the elements. The elements can work in a harmonious way this way or asymmetrically, so symmetrically or asymmetrically, both work, but the top and the bottom in this case are in harmony with each other. And again, the elements within the piece are also in harmony with each other, as well as with other pots. Or other sculptures. Sculptures. Sensual. I want the work to look sensual. Not necessarily sexual, although that could be part of it, but it's all about sensuality. It's about that touch. I even want people to smell it. In fact, I'm going to go on a sidebar here. I had the greatest experience last night here in the museum. We did a meditation. There's a meditation group that meets here Wednesday night. So I met with the meditation group. We toured the exhibition. We talked about it a little bit, and everybody sort of either picked a piece or a general energy or whatever. And then we came back up here and we meditated on it. And then the person who led the meditation asked everybody to go around the room and talk about what it was that happened. And one woman cried. Another woman said, "Oh my God, I just looked at, it was the mug, that pine mug." She said, "Every time I looked at that mug, I could just smell it." Another guy said, "I just felt like I was constantly in the forest." So that's what I mean by sensuality. That's like where you're bringing in your senses into the work. So a lot of that, at least visually, comes through touch. Like this tension, this visual tension here has a certain sensuality to it. Right? Or the way the branches embrace or feel around the base. Here's that piece from downstairs, the way those roots grip on that rock. So that was like an intentional, even though I worked spontaneously, that was an intentional, like I want some sensuality in this piece, and I'm gonna have those roots really embrace that rock and become and feel part of that rock. I want the work to look sophisticated. I want there to be a certain maturity and elegance to the work, so I'm thinking about that as I'm doing the design. And now that I've done this long enough, I really spend as much time on design as I do on carving. Like most people think all the work is in the carving it to look like wood. And I spend a ton of time on design, cutting branches off, designing, redesigning. And I've done it so long, I can actually watch a football game or a basketball, I could go watch the games tonight and carve it to look like wood. But design I have to do against a blank wall and a blank slate without any distractions. Because again, I think that's the kind of the most important part. I want the work to be emotive. I want the work to bring out emotions in people. I don't care what that emotion is. You can cry, you can laugh, you can be mad. It doesn't matter. That's your emotion, your journey, your experience of the artwork. But if I bring out an emotion, I feel like I've succeeded. Like that's really my goal. And that's the reward. Like it's great to sell work. I'm a full-time artist. I have to sell work. It's my job. I have to put my kids through school and feed them. And it's very validating to sell work. I mean, it's at least good for my ego because somebody's putting their hard-earned money into something I made. Super rewarding. But the real reward is that emotion. I'd give up all of the rest to be able to make work that brings out an emotion and touches somebody. So sometimes the emotion can be something I have in it. This is a 10-foot long floor sculpture. So, from the table at another 4 feet or so, it's about that big. It looks like a log that's fallen down out of the woods and fallen apart, but when you look at it overhead, it takes on the form of an angel. This one is very emotional for me. It's called Fallen Angel, and it was a cathartic piece I made about my dad. And so no one else would necessarily know that, but sometimes the emotion that's in it is mine. What's interesting is I work a lot from my subconscious. I'm not a classically trained artist. I do sketch stuff out a little bit sometimes, but only as a starting point. And so a good example of subconscious, the whole time I was making Fallen Angel, I was listening to the book Moby Dick and I was watching whale videos. Sometimes I get tired of music and I have like a whale video or something on in the background. What I noticed only after the whole thing was done and it came out of the kiln was the head kind of looked like a blue whale to me. It looked like the head of a blue whale. And I thought, I bet I could make that sculpture a whale. So I used all of the same components except one thing. The only thing I had to make was a tail. So if I take Fallen Angel and rearrange her, I actually have birched whale, because I can't resist a bad pun. But birched whale, I'm usually talking about the environment and people's effect on the environment. This was a way to bring it into the ocean with like the ribs and everything else falling apart on a whale, because it's all about, for me, it's all about how we disregard nature, but nature maintains its beauty. I want the works to have some narrative to them. And so someone might ask, why did that beetle borer stop and turn around? Or what caused those cracks? Was it hit by lightning? Was it left out in the sun? So the narrative becomes a place of inquiry. Sometimes the narrative can be literal. This one's called Tree of Love and is a true or is a story. It does have stories within it. So essentially, this piece has a bunch of people that were in love with initials carved in there, and depending on how old or historically that is, they're either weathered or not weathered. So it starts with Adam and Eve. But the fun part of this one was at the time I made it. It's a little hard to see, but it says Brad plus Jen. But then Jen is crossed out and it says Angie in something lighter, as if it's been done sooner. So it was back in the Brad Pitt and Jennifer Aniston days, happened to be the time of that. Or the story might be in the name. This is one's downstairs. It's called United We Stand, and it's all about solidarity, and sticks and stones can break our bones, but if we stand together, we can hold up to that, including in this sort of frozen moment of time, right? Or the story might be, wow, well, like, how did that chair happen out of nature, and who sits in a chair like that? So it's all about like raising inquiry. So kind of like I was saying before, the great craftsmanship that creates the impact. Like, you look at it and you go, oh my God, that looks so much like wood, and that creates impact. But what really makes it art is that story and that emotion that's in the piece. To me, that's really what makes it art. So for me as an artist, it's all about seeing the light. It's all about finding those things inside me and letting them come out. And again, all of this happens for me subconsciously. I don't premeditate it. Other artists work the other way, and there's not, it's not a right or wrong. It's just different ways of working. But for me, it's all about being able to see things and translate them. In every one of these examples I'm about to show, I actually made the piece first, and only after it came out of the kiln did I recognize something in it and go backwards. So I spend a lot of time in the woods, right, and around fire. Here's how fire may translate. But again, I didn't think fire and made that. I probably was a time of year I was camping a lot. Made that piece, it came out of the kiln, and when it came out, I was like, oh my God, there's a flame. So a bunch of examples like that. Spend a lot of time on the water. Here's how water might show up. This is a print of a fan that was in my living room, and this one particular element of the fan, I had to go by it every day to go to my studio, kind of showed up in my work. I made that piece, and it wasn't, again, until it came out of the kiln, and I was like, oh my God, that's the fan in the living room. Architecture comes into play a lot, so that might show up in the form of a piece. Anything nature-related shows up. Here, this cloud is actually in the negative space, which in this case, the negative space is the brown. Like, that's where I see the cloud in that piece. I love Asian calligraphy. I think it's one of the most beautiful art forms on the planet. Like, talk about breathtaking. Look at that brush stroke, that thick to thin, that rough edge, the visual tension of those, like, it's just beautiful. I can't read it, but it's just beautiful as an art form. And here's how it may translate into a sculpture. This is an 8-foot tall tree. And so I get to take artistic license. Trees don't grow thick to thin like that, but that's really like a calligraphy stroke. And again, I made that tree and then found the calligraphy stroke, and it wasn't the other way around. And the same happens up close. right? So it's all of that, like that thick to thin, the beautiful gesture, the movement in it, and so on. I don't dance very well, but I really like dance. Alion's wife was a dance instructor. This was her dance troupe. Here's how it may show up in a piece. My sister's a dance instructor as well. I said, send me a picture of a student. She sends me Lily, and I'm like, I have that pot. Like the minute I saw the picture of Lily, I knew exactly the piece. I also have a cousin who's a choreographer. Same thing. She sent me the picture. I'm like, oh my God, that's the top of that teapot. This is a spout of a teapot. And if you turn it upside down, it almost looks like a person running. So again, those anthropomorphic elements come into play. I love the human body. So human body shows up a lot in my work without even me necessarily thinking of it. A branch might not really look like a branch. It might look like an elbow or a knee and a thigh and a calf. So all of that stuff is coming out, as well as some formal training. I mentioned that I did study some art history, and Michelangelo was my hero, and so I've kind of borrowed some of that visual tension at times from some formal education and things. Although one of the biggest things I got out of the Sistine Chapel was the cracks. I did a study of the cracks on the ceiling, and then those end up showing up as the cracks that I carve into the sides of the teapots. And lightning takes a very similar form as well. I mentioned I don't draw very well, and I don't, but I do sometimes have to remember an idea because some of these pieces take months to make. So in this case, I was thinking, I want to make a woman in repose. And I got called into dinner. I never got any farther than just starting the sketch. By the time I was done with dinner, I had an idea of what I wanted to make, how I wanted to interpret her in clay, and this ended up being the final piece. So my sketch is really just a starting point, so I just kind of know where to start with my form. And then fortunately with clay, as a malleable material as opposed to, say, marble, I can change it all the time. So I can work very spontaneously. If I put a spout on the teapot and come out the next morning and don't like it, I can cut it off, just put another spout on. So I can't imagine being like Michelangelo and you sneeze at the wrong time and there goes an arm. Like, that's got to suck. So here's another drawing. This was the piece I made from it, and then like 5 years later made another piece. So I do sometimes revisit work and just interpret things differently from time to time. So similar to all those examples that I gave, one of the overall thing in all of my work is I want there to be flow. I want there to be visual flow. So I love when someone looks at a piece of work and sees my story in it, sees the message I'm trying to get out, but I really don't care if they get that. I want them to have their own journey in the work, right? We all see the world ethnocentrically. We see it through our own eyes, through our own glasses, whatever. And my guide as an artist, our guide, all of us as artists, or our job as artists is to guide people through the artwork. And so I'm using flow to do that. Where they stop, what they do, what touches them is up to them. But I can help guide them through that experience. So look at how your eye comes right through this piece, through the beetle borer, and then relieves the visual tension out the spout. So just like a painter can use texture and line and everything else to guide you through a painting, I'm able to do that. All artists are able to do that, not just me, through what we create three-dimensionally. This is that same piece upside from above. I actually think that the flow through that view is really better. And so, just another example of that. But as you look at the work now, you can start to see that. I do work three-dimensionally. I work like Michelangelo or really any sculptor, but he's kind of the one who coined it about working 360 degrees. I stand on my table and look down over the work because I never know if a piece is going to show up in a museum that's got a balcony, or like the birched whale and angel piece that are meant to be looked at from overhead. So I'm always thinking three-dimensionally and think about all those characteristics. Like, look at that visual tension right there, right? Like, beautiful. Look at the harmony and the grace that's in that piece. So no matter what angle you're at, some of those characteristics are coming up by working three-dimensionally. Right, and I want the work to be able to play together well and have those elements come into play. And I want to talk a little bit about the process for people that are process-oriented. Everything I make is hand-carved. It starts as clay that comes out of the bag. I make the form. When I make the form, I really have two personalities as an artist. When I make the form, I'm very 1970s Eric. The form is very active for me, and I'm making stuff, cutting stuff, changing stuff. I'm listening to Led Zeppelin, and the music's blaring, and I'm throwing my hair around. And then I go to the carving part. and I'm listening to Loons on a Lake and Rachmaninoff or Tibetan bowls or something like that, and it becomes very meditative. So it's almost like having two different personalities as I'm making the work. But I do, again, I do sometimes like stand right on my table. I get very intimate with the work, very close with the work. Sometimes I work with jeweler's glasses on, so I'm working at that level of detail a lot of the time. And I mentioned form, right? Again, form is so important. This is a bisqueware piece. Bisqueware is that first firing you do, for those who don't know. Just like a mug, I'm doing the same thing. I make it in clay, put it in the kiln, it comes out. A mug you would put glaze on, I'm putting ceramic stains and oxides, which is what gives it color. Essentially glaze without the glass, because trees aren't shiny. But in any case, when it comes out of bisqueware, it's ugly. It's like salmon pink and like monochromatic browns. It's just like not pretty. But it's like a beautiful pot. Like that's how I judge my work. If it looks good in bisqueware, I know I've got a good pot. And then when it's done, all of those elements of layer and color and everything else bring out the realism and make that beauty shine, but it's the form that's really so good. So really quickly, this is a life-size tea table. It's about as wide as the kiln. In fact, that it's made in two sections, bottom, top. The top is just enough to get in the kiln and scrape my knuckles on the sides. But this is how the pieces are made if I'm working in my studio. I use whatever type of clay method matches the piece. In this case, wheel thrown. In something like the basket, it's a flattened out slab of clay. I may use that chipe method that Master Jean taught me, Keith Richards taught me. But anyway, this one started on the potter's wheel. I can add some clay to it. Clay is soft. I can alter the form. I threw a second piece and attached it to now make it taller. I brought in some inexpensive labor to help with the details. Put the bark on. And something like that takes a month or more to make. So I have to keep it wet as I'm working from one area to another. So I've got to wrap areas in plastic, and I can even spray it with a spritz bottle to keep the clay damp up until the point that I start to carve with the X-Acto knife. Once it gets that small, you can't spray it anymore, the details come into play. So there is a part where I really have to like pull all-nighters and like just work through the piece because it's at that moisture level. I carve parts that you don't see. I carve a lot of, not every pot, but I carve the inside of a lot of pots. There's a very famous potter named Bernard Leach, who's a very famous British potter. Someone asked him one time, what makes a great pot? And the answer was when the parts you don't see are as good as the parts you do see. And so I try to impart that wisdom that he had into everything I make, because I feel like if the parts you don't see are really good, how good are the parts that you do see going to be? It also honors the material, it honors the process. I think it puts a spirit and energy into the pot, not to get all frou-frou about it. But again, I think the works are successful not because they look like wood, but because they have spirit, because they have energy, because they have emotion in them. And that's one of the ways that I get it into it. I sign every piece. This is the top of that. So that the top was made as slab as a second separate piece. I start to carve the details as the clay is soft. The harder the clay gets, the more detail I can get until it's finally done. Put the bark on the outside. Here's how it looks out of the kiln. And again, back to what ended up being the finished piece. All right, y'all are great. You're hanging in there. We're coming down the home stretch. So what next? What happens next? And I put this in because a lot of people have been asking me about this weekend, and it shows up in this exhibition. So I had making trees for 20-something years. Like, how many birch trees do you need to make? And how many people need a birch tree in their living room? And so I was starting to kind of max out on it a little bit and needing some new creativity, and that coincided with the pandemic, coincidentally. And so the pandemic hit, and I, like every artist on the planet, was unemployed and bored. And so at the time I was on the board of directors of Starworks, which is an art center down near Seagrove, and they have a glass hot shop, a clay studio, and a metal shop. And so we had no residents, and we're having a board meeting, and like we're talking about having nobody in the place, and then I'll do it. And because I had always wanted to try something new. So I thought, I'm going to go down and work with glass and see about combining glass with clay. I didn't know how that was going to happen. I went in totally open-minded. So I did get a North Carolina Arts Council grant to fund that since I was not working. I went back to my roots to get started and actually made a couple of pots on the potter's wheel. That one was fired in gas. This one is a Shino glaze. So I'm kind of just trying to reorient myself to materials and then hop into what is different between clay and glass, and that's that glass is transparent. And that was some of the magic. So I learned how to blow glass, very basic blow glass, but I learned all the glass techniques. I learned how to blow glass. I learned how to flame work glass. I learned how to hot cast glass. And I learned how to kiln cast glass. So I learned a variety of different ways. And the great thing about kiln casting, so this is about a 40-pound piece of glass. That piece is about this wide, and this is pine down below. But what's great about casting glass is I could do it in my kilns. Same kiln that you use for casting versus not. Blowing is different. You need a furnace, but to cast something, I could do it right in my kilns. So that started to get me thinking. The other thing that glass has that clay doesn't, at least the clay I'm working with doesn't, is color. So I've spent 20 years learning working in monochromatic, matte, nature-looking, what's my color palette? 7 colors or something like that. All of a sudden, I see all this glass. I'm like, ooh, shiny. Like, look at that. How much fun is that going to be? And so I started to work in pâte de verre, which is paste of glass. And the way that works is you make the form in clay. You cast the clay in plaster, you pull the clay out of the plaster so you have an empty mold, and then you pack glass frit in. And glass frit is little pieces of glass. It's almost like sand. Comes in every color under the sun, and you mix it with something that's sticky, and you pack it into the side of the mold. You fire the mold in the kiln. The mold gets weak. You take it out of the kiln, you peel the plaster off, and you're left with the work that's downstairs, which is called sugar firing. It looks almost like sugar. So as artists, we're all illusionists, right? So the obvious illusion is Eric makes stuff looks like leather, clay, or wood, rocks, whatever. That part's the obvious illusion. Then this illusion is all about fragility and the fragility of nature. So what? Why do all of this stuff? As I mentioned right at the beginning, yeah, gotta sell stuff, pay the bills, and there's some validation in that, but it's really about connections. It's all about connections. I want my artwork to connect with other artwork. I wanted to be able to work out in the world with other artwork. I wanted to play well with its own family, with its siblings. So I wanted to connect with that. And I want the message to be all about sharing space on the planet, which means connecting with humans because we're the ones who are beating up the planet so much. So I want work to be able to connect to them in inquiry. I wanted to create some dialogue. I wanted to be a conduit for me to be able to talk to the environment. It's a way to open the door and talk about those things with people and share ideas and share the importance of how we treat the planet. So my real goal is that people look at the work and go, wow, even in degradation, nature is beautiful. And I have a choice, and I can walk on the planet with softer steps. So it's the people that walk with softer steps, then I feel I've done my job as an artist and as a messenger. So in all that making, in all that conceptualizing, in all that soapboxing, after I've done all of that, I'm pretty freaking tired. And that's the end. All right.